I think we're now live on YouTube.
Should I share my screen?
Do you have a cover slide you want to share?
Yeah, I could do that.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, everyone. Hello. Good morning from the States. Afternoon, evening across the pond. My name is Lauren Hayes, and I'm hosting the FIND seminar today. Thanks all for being here. I think we're going to have a really exciting, fun seminar today. Looking forward to it, and I'll introduce the speaker in just a moment. Before I do that, I'd like to thank our last speaker, Christian Perk, for a really fascinating talk on honeybees last week. If you didn't get the chance to see his talk, it's on the YouTube page. You can take a look at it. Just a quick announcement before I forget about next week. Next week we have Laszlo Gerazimigi. I don't know if I said that correctly. I apologize. If I did, Laszlo is going to be talking about the evolutionary ecology of dogs, so it should be interesting. He's a leader in the development of phylogenetic models, so it'll be interesting to hear his talk. Just a couple of quick reminders about today's seminar for those of you who are new. First, it's about a 45-minute talk followed by about 45 minutes to an hour of discussion. And during discussion, I'll be moderating the questions coming from you, and also hopefully I have folks helping me watch YouTube. If you have questions from the YouTube group, just put them in there. And if you're in the Zoom link, just put a question mark in the chat, and I'll relay that to the speaker, today's speaker. And we encourage those of you that are students to get involved. We like hearing from you, so please make sure ask questions. Don't be afraid to pose a question. And so this brings me to today's speaker, who today we're really lucky to have Jerry Carter from Ohio State University joining us. Jerry is an assistant professor at Ohio State. He earned his PhD at the University of Maryland, working with Gerald Wilkinson. Following that, he had a series of really excellent postdoc positions. He was at the Smithsonian for a while. He worked at the Max Planck Institute with Damien Farine and Ian Cousin. And he also has maintained a research association with the Smithsonian Tropical Institute in Panama. His research engages in trying to understand how animals choose, maintain, and regulate social relationships. So he's really diving into that social structure that can be quite difficult to quantify, and has generated some really exciting stuff, which I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing about today. He recently got an NSF grant, about $1 million NSF grant, a big deal here, and is doing some work with, I believe, folks at Cincinnati. I think it was Ian Hamilton and Liz Hobson. And I think this is evidence of the excitement that his research is generating. He's published very well at a really excellent rate and quality at an early career stage. I counted, Google Scholar, around 60 publications in journals like Journal of Animal Ecology, Biology Letters, all the good behavior journals, ProcB. So he's doing some really nice work. He also has a really excellent website if you want to check it out. It's socialbat.org. He maintains information about his lab group, but also has a blog. And I think and Jerry, you might correct me on it, it's about science as an activity is the title of it, or is that one?
That's one post? Of the topics. So there's just a number of different topics, and you can sort of sort them by topic.
I think it's a good blog to look at to get some feedback, especially students who want to know about like what to do in grad school and things like that, and also see what his lab's doing. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry. Today's seminar title is Cooperative Relationships in Vampire Bats.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's really an honor to be included in this list of speakers. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to attend these seminars. I'm usually teaching at this time, but it's been really amazing to see all of these recorded talks go online. I think it's this really fantastic resource. I feel like it's something we should have been doing for a long time, that you can go and watch these talks even if you weren't able to make the seminar. So thank you for organizing this. So I'll start with the sort of obligatory big picture here. So, for over 100 years, biologists have been asking this basic question, why is it that some organism evolved some altruistic or cooperative trait? Why do worker ants forego reproduction work for their colony? Why do meerkats, other cooperative breeders, do something similar to that? You have mutualisms of exchange. What prevents cheating, where an individual gets the benefits of cooperation without paying the cost? Why is there frequent cheating in some species and some mutualisms, but not in others? Why do humans have these pro-social psychological urges to help other people that we see in need? And so this study of cooperation and conflict goes all the way back to the beginning of evolutionary biology. It's this huge interdisciplinary field now, from economics. And the place where I want to sort of begin is just discussing that when you look across different species, there's this diversity of cooperative traits, and this varies with the type of social complexity or the type of society that you see. Let me just adjust this slide a little bit. Yeah. So I quite like this distinction from this paper by Lucas and Clutton-Brock, looking at mammals and what it means to be socially complex. A lot of people talk about their study organism as being socially complex. And at least in mammals, they sort of note that people tend to mean one of two different things by this. So most work on social cooperation tries to understand what we might call a cooperative society, like eusocial insects or cooperative breeders, where the individuals in these societies give us real clear examples of cooperative traits or even altruistic traits. If you were a female worker ant, naked mole rat, you might be a helper rather than a breeder. You sacrifice your reproduction or even your life for your colony, which is also your family. Inclusive fitness is tightly linked to the performance of your group. You can have division of labor and so on. And so Lucas and Clutton-Brock call this organizational social complexity. And on the other hand, we have organisms like primates that are socially complex, but they don't really do this kind of extreme cooperation or altruism. So humans, I think, they're not as altruistic as bees. Primate societies are complex in this completely different way, where individuals are in a community that's not completely kin. So they're kin, but most individuals you meet are not kin. And within the same group, you can have close friends and associates and allies and rivals and bullies, and every relationship can be different. Every individual might have a different social rank. And so to navigate this kind of social world, you might have to, for instance, groom particular individuals, try to change your relationships with other individuals over time. And Lucas and Clutton-Brock call this relational social complexity. And I think there's evidence for this outside of primates, just not as well studied, like you see in evidence for this in cetaceans, maybe corvids. And I hope to convince you that vampire bats are also in this sort of in this bin or in this category of animals with these long-term cooperative relationships where there's a mixture of cooperation and conflict. So I think we really understand these, I think we really understand these cooperative societies, eusocial insects and cooperative breeders better than some of these other cases. And one of the insights that's emerged here is that cooperation is often stabilized by multiple factors. So, for example, we understand that genetic relatedness is really important, and kin selection is a driving force for eusociality. Eusociality only evolved in lineages where you have lifetime monogamy. But we also know that relatedness isn't everything. Cooperation is also stable because you've got competition between colonies, and reproductive altruism within the colony is actually enforced in many of these colonies. So these are workers here that are punishing another worker that tried to lay eggs. These ants are clonal, so relatedness is 100%. And yeah, you can still have this cheating and punishment. Here's worker policing in bees. And so here's this plot showing that worker policing can suppress this selfish reproduction here, effectiveness of policing on the x-axis and this sort of selfish reproduction on the y-axis. But surprisingly, high relatedness is actually correlated with more selfish cheating within the colony. So even among kin, enforcement is often necessary to suppress selfishness. And this is becoming increasingly clear across a number of systems. So if we turn to the other kind of social complexity, we look at these cooperative relationships. Are they actively enforced by strategic and conditional grooming and things like partner switching, or are these social bonds more simple, more easy because there's just inherently low conflict and inherently high fitness interdependence? And I think this just depends on who you ask, and it's sort of this common debate on whether cooperation in these kinds of long-term relationships that we see, for instance, in like chimpanzees, is this actively enforced by conditional investments? So in other words, reciprocity, or is cooperation inherently stable on its own, where the individuals are making investments, but these investments are guaranteed to give returns because the fitness is already inherently correlated in these pairs. So it's a very safe investment. And there's quite a lot of debate about this, but I think increasingly we're seeing that this is a false dichotomy. And that's the point, I think, made clearly by this paper by Redwin, Bashiri, and others in 2016, which is basically to say that it's perhaps better to think about this as a continuous spectrum. So on one end, you have a real prisoner's dilemma situation where cooperation has to be enforced because a bad partner can make you even worse off than if you had never met this individual, if you never made an investment. And so to ensure good returns, you have to reward good partners or switch away from bad ones. On the other end, you can imagine a situation where there's no real conflict, like a byproduct mutualism, or where there's investments, but the returns are very safe. And so Bashiri and others argue that most cases in nature are going to be somewhere in this gray area, where there's a mix of both some interdependence, but also some sort of conditional, some kind of contingency. And a key point here is also that if you have this spectrum, it's possible that relationships are going to move along the spectrum back and forth over time, over evolutionary time or over ecological time. And so to study this kind of change, I think it's useful to track the development of cooperative relationships from start to finish. And this is what I'm hoping to work on with using vampire bats. So I started working on food sharing and vampire bats during my PhD, in part because it's this really controversial case. Regurgitated food sharing in vampire bats had long been a textbook example of reciprocity, reciprocal altruism. But starting in like the mid-1990s, the whole idea of reciprocity became increasingly controversial over time. So I think sometimes for good reason, but sometimes for bad reason. But what I want to argue here is that vampire bats actually are, I think, also a good example of a more general point to make about cooperation, which is that these things are not necessarily competing hypotheses, and that cooperative relationships can be stabilized by multiple forces working together. And cooperative traits that evolve for one reason, for instance, through kin selection, might be co-opted for other reasons or might be stabilized by other mechanisms. So one of the big advantages of studying cooperative relationships in vampire bats over, say, primates, which also have these very complex relationships with cooperation conflict all in the mix, is that vampire bats are just really small and we can study them in small spaces. And so they're larger than a lab mouse, but they're smaller than a rat. And most of the drama of vampire bat social life is occurring in a space that's no bigger than like a closet. And they are in these hollow trees or hollows inside of caves. And we can bring the bats into captivity into the lab, and they quickly habituate to that environment. And they do all the same things that we see in the wild roost. They do this in the lab. And as I'll show you, we can also go back and forth from the field to the lab, which gives us some ability to do things that would be difficult to do with other systems. And of course, the other thing that is interesting about vampire bats is this food sharing. So adult vampire bats only feed on blood. So this is one feeding on a chicken's foot, just for size here. They get one meal a night. If they miss 2 meals, they're fairly weak. 3 meals, they can die. But they have this social safety net, which is that unfed bats can come back to the roost and receive regurgitated donations of blood meals from their closest associates. So it's just like mothers will feed their offspring, like you see in many different species. They'll do this. And vampire bats also, the females will feed their offspring via regurgitation, but they also do this for other adults. And these donations are important in nature because the adults are missing a meal about every couple of weeks, and younger bats are missing a meal like every few days. And we can induce these donations in the lab by simply fasting a bat overnight and putting it back. This is called a fasting trial. And in a fasting trial, we can measure this event you're seeing here. We can measure the amount of time that this bat licks this other bat's mouth, and you can see that this correlates well with the weight change in the receiver. And then we can also manipulate this in many different ways. So here we've put a bat inside of it, trapped it inside of a cage, and we're seeing the other one come down to the ground to feed it through the cage bars. And we know that they recognize each other using contact calls. And females are attracted to the calls of non-kin that feed them, but not necessarily to the calls of kin that don't feed them. So over the last 10 years, I've now done almost 1,200 of these fasting trials from 5 different colonies, different locations. And so just constantly repeating the experiment I've done before and then adding something new onto the end. And so the data I'm going to be showing you are sort of coming from a mix of these different studies. And I want to address these 3 questions. So first, why do vampire bats share food? How do food sharing relationships form between bats that start as strangers? And what is a relationship? What is a cooperative relationship? And so first, just turning to why they share food. Is it indirect fitness benefits, kin selection? Is it reciprocity in the form of conditional helping or partner switching? So I mean it in the broad sense. Is it fitness interdependence, meaning that there's an inherent correlation between the fitness of the donor and the receiver, even in the absence of reciprocity? Or is all of this above the case? And okay, so spoiler alert, I think it's all of these things are playing a role, and I'll just try to quickly take you through the evidence for each of these during this talk. And so this is something we've studied extensively. It's basically me and Jerry Wilkinson, the 2 people who've worked on food sharing in vampire bats. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but all the work that I'm going to show you is consistent with reciprocity. We still haven't proved it yet. Been trying to do that since first year of my PhD. Fitness interdependence is hard to test, but I'll also discuss that as well. So the first thing to note here is that food sharing is almost certainly co-opted from maternal care behavior. Female vampire bats have this extreme maternal care for a bat. So they have 1 pup a year. The gestation period is about 7 months, which is really long for bats for other bats or for bats in their family. They nurse their pup for upwards of 10 months, which is 3 times longer than other neotropical bats. They carry this infant around that can be half their mass. And so it's this big investment they make, and they balance this slow reproduction and large investment with a really long lifespan. So these bats can live to be 17 years old in the wild. And I have a record of a bat that's about 30 years old in captivity, which is a long time for such a small mammal. So as far as I know, all the females feed their pups, and this continues when the pups grow up. The males disperse after their first year. The females are philopatric. The mothers keep feeding their offspring, and if they're daughters, this just turns into a sort of life. As far as we know, this turns into a lifelong relationship. Eventually, the daughters start reciprocating back to their mothers. So I've seen a daughter as young as 4 months old drink blood on her own and then regurgitate it to her mother that I fasted. And so this is a bat that's still nursing, but will feed her mother when her mother's in need. So this is a really weird situation. I can't think of any other mammal where this kind of thing happens. So all these relationships tend to be symmetrical. So females also feed other kin, like their half sisters or granddaughters, and they also feed non-kin. So most of these are symmetrical, and you also see these weak one-way sharing relationships, typically with non-kin. And it's not clear if these are actually one-way relationships or if we just haven't sampled this relationship enough. So it could be it's symmetrical, but we just haven't seen the reciprocation. And no female feeds every bat in her group. So if you just look at the bats that this bat is associating with or living with, there'll be a number of individuals they feed, but it's never everybody. And the controversy comes from this point, which many people don't realize. Many people are surprised to hear 95% of food sharing occurs with close kin. So 78% of it is maternal care, 16% of it is other kin. Only this 5% goes to non-kin. So at this point, it makes sense to ask, is this just kin selection? And a lot of people pointed out that, well, why is there so much attention being paid to the symmetry of these relationships? Can't we just explain this all as kin selection or a byproduct of kin selection? And my argument is going to be that the answer is no, and I hope to explain why that's the case. So the first thing that was noted from these early field studies done by Gerald Wilkinson in the 1980s is that even after you control for kinship, co-roosting predicts food sharing. This is because all the bats that are sharing food with each other are highly associated, but not all of them are kin. And the estimated effect of co-roosting association is a little higher than kinship. And most bats in the network are not close kin. The mean kinship is 0.08 with a high variance. So it's not family groups. In fact, they don't live in stable groups at all. The roosting composition is changing almost every day. And so it's these bats that are often switching roosts together, that are the ones that are sharing food with each other. So what I did in the beginning of my PhD was I put bats all together into constant association. So everyone is familiar, but these are bats that were born in different locations. They're not housed together for their whole life, but they're sort of put together for several years. And then I fasted all of the bats repeatedly over time. You can make a food sharing network like this one. So this is over a 4-year period based on over 1,300 observations. So the red nodes are the females, the blue nodes are the male, and the size of the node is how many recipients a bat fed, and the width of the arrow shows the donation rate from one bat to another. The mean kinship of this group is exactly what you'd see in a wild colony, mix of non-kin and multiple matrilines of kin. And the females form bonds with other females. Predominantly, most of the food sharing is between females, which is what you also see in the field. The best predictor of how much bat A feeds bat B is how much bat B feeds bat A. That's more important than kinship. But this isn't actually really strong evidence for reciprocity. And what I hope to show you is that I think the best evidence that there's a direct fitness benefit comes from the way that these bats form new relationships. So non-kin form new relationships in ways that can't be explained as a byproduct of kin selection. You can't explain the symmetry that you see here between non-kin as potentially maybe two bats smell similar, and so they both think they might be related, and so it might be much worse to accidentally let a kin individual die than to accidentally feed non-kin. And so this could cause this symmetrical pattern. But what I hope to show you is that the way that these bats form relationships can't easily be explained by kin selection alone. So one important strategy based on sort of early papers on reciprocity is called raising the stakes or testing the waters, which equates to making small cooperative investments at first and then gradually increasing them in partners that provide the best returns. And this is shown to work in simulations and also in humans playing sort of economic style public goods games. But we don't really know if this exists in nature or what it would look like in non-human animals. So I think one form it could take is if vampire bats transition to higher cost, riskier cooperative behaviors over time. So first they might test tolerance with a stranger just by clustering. Then they might try grooming, and if that's reciprocated, they might groom more, and then eventually share food with individuals as they get to know them, and sort of escalating upwards. So I haven't talked about social grooming in vampire bats. This is a bat grooming itself. A bat that's grooming itself is several times more likely to be groomed by another bat nearby. Bat receives more grooming after you attach something to it, like these when we first put the bands on their wings. Also, if you mess up its fur and make its fur all wet, they'll also receive more grooming from other bats. And vampire bats are special when it comes to social grooming. So they groom each other more than any other bat, to my knowledge. Here are grooming rates in vampire bats compared to some other bat species. These are all individuals under the same captive conditions. And female vampire bats spend 5% of their active time grooming each other, whether that's in the wild or in the field, or whether they have ectoparasites or no ectoparasites. So what we tested for is whether reciprocal grooming increases before sharing begins and whether they show this pattern. So to do this, we have to start with strangers. So we took bats from sites that are hundreds of kilometers apart, and then we put them together in captivity. So here's a stranger being introduced to a group of familiar bats. And this does happen in the wild, because even though females are mostly philopatric, you get females joining a group of females that they're now all unrelated to. And this happens like every couple of years, at least it seems from Jerry Wilkinson's data. So we started with 2 groups that were separate. We did fasting trials with them just to sort of try to map out the relationships within these groups. Then we did these controlled introductions either in pairs or in quartets. And we did 106 fasting trials under this scenario. Then we put everybody together. During this time, there were several bats that were also born into the group. And so we also looked at how they formed relationships with the adults in the group. And we did 532 fasting trials over 300 days. So this is what the accumulation of first donations look like. So over a 10-month period, this is during the period where everybody's thrown together, 15% of the female past strangers formed food sharing bonds with individuals that they were previously unfamiliar with and also unrelated to. And most of the bats by the end were grooming each other. So one prediction we made is pretty simple, is that the bats in the isolated pairs would bond faster if social experience matters here. And so the x-axis shows the type of introduction, whether we introduce them as a pair or one to a group of three, or everybody together where there's an in-group and an out-group. And the basic prediction is that there's going to be this kind of college roommate effect where these bats are going to form relationships much faster than the others. And this is essentially what we found. Isolated pairs actually did start sharing faster than pairs introduced where they also could associate with their in-group. We also predicted the following pattern. So time is on the x-axis. The y-axis is the probability of A grooming B. And the idea is that if B later fed A, we expected the grooming rate from A to B to be going up over time. And this not to be the case, or for it to be less of the case for cases where this pair never formed a food sharing relationship, where B never fed A. And this is what we saw in the actual data. So the grooming dynamics did predict the new food sharing relationships that formed. And this is the grooming only before the first food donation. So this should happen up until the food sharing relationships start, but not afterwards. So we also predicted this pattern that for every relationship, if you center it on a sort of day zero, you should see this ramping up of grooming before that day, and then the relationship shouldn't be continuing to increase afterwards. And this is also, again, what we saw. The grooming rates increased up until food sharing began, but not after food sharing was going. And finally, we expect these relationships to emerge in a reciprocal pattern, and they also did as well. So the bats, so it was actually the very first new food donation that I saw from one bat to another was followed by the second new food donation, which was that same bat, the recipient, then feeding the donor. And I remember that moment because that was a moment where I thought this experiment might actually work and it wouldn't take a ridiculously long time, because I had no idea how long it would take for these relationships to emerge. So I remember that. And then if you just look over all the data, that these reciprocations were occurring way more than you expect by chance. So this is all consistent with this idea that vampire bats build up new reciprocal food sharing relationships by testing the waters via grooming. And I think this is good evidence that these non-kin relationships can't be explained simply by phenotypic similarity, like two bats smelling similar or being incorrect about who their kin are in the same direction. And they bond faster when they're isolated with fewer bats, which is consistent with this idea that the social experience really matters. And I also think that this raising the stakes idea might be pretty common, but we just haven't tested it in the right way. And I think it's really important to look at this at the moment that cooperation is emerging between strangers and not necessarily like within a single bout of interaction. And I also think it's important maybe to also look at different kinds of behaviors rather than just the rate of, say, grooming increasing, but there might be sort of transitions between different kinds of behaviors that vary in cost. So another question here is, why do bats form non-kin bonds when they already have kin bonds? Why not just reciprocate with kin? You can get all of the inclusive fitness benefits of both the kin selection component and if there is this reciprocity, then you could have it all. And so there's a couple of possibilities here. One possibility is that having more non-kin bonds is just better. Or another possibility is that there might be a trade-off, some kind of trade-off between quantity and quality of partners, where quality would be, for instance, feeding relatives is probably, those relationships are probably have higher returns, and also they tend to be stronger relationships anyway. So this could just be due to errors in recognition. So the reason that these bats, I sort of skipped a slide here, which I took out for time, but one thing I want to just tell you, because I think I can just tell you, is that there's a lot of individual variation in how much bats share food with non-kin. So some bats don't really share food with non-kin. They share with their mother, and their mother shares with them. And that's pretty much, that's their situation over years. And then other bats are feeding a number of non-kin in the group. And there's just a lot of variation between these individuals. And so this is what I'm trying to ask here is like, why would these individuals be these individuals that are being very generous with their food sharing? Are they making mistakes? Is this a sort of, I don't want to let my kin die, so I'm going to just play it safe and just feed anyone who might be related to me? Or is it that these individuals here just always do better? Or these individuals actually performing doing things correctly, and you just want to have as big of a network as possible, and these individuals just for whatever reason just can't form non-kin relationships? Or another possibility is that the benefits of these different strategies, if there are strategies, might vary with the environment that you're in. And that's a hypothesis that I call social bet hedging, which is the idea that bats invest in non-kin to diversify their investments beyond family, to buffer against loss of family or the lack of presence of family. Because when the bats are switching around, they're sometimes on a particular night not even in the same roost as their mother or their sister might be. And so they can't always predict who's going to be immediately around them when they have these fission fusion dynamics and roost switching. And so the idea here is that you don't want to put all of your sort of cooperative investment eggs in just one basket, that it would be better in terms of per capita returns to invest in, say, your mother. But since your mother's not always there for you, that's why you want to have these other non-kin relationships. That's the idea here. So the evidence for this comes from this experiment where we looked at each female's success at being fed in one of two conditions. So in the treatment condition, we removed a key donor. And if there's a mother or daughter, that's always the mother or the daughter. In the baseline condition, we prevented sharing from a non-donor that had never fed the subject in 4 years. So it's just sort of a control. Nothing's really changing in the food sharing network for this bat. And then we asked, how well do they cope with this situation? And does that depend on how many non-kin they fed in previous years? And so I'm going to show you the data here. So on the y-axis is going to be the average food received during the trial. And on the x-axis, we have the number of non-kin females that those bats fed in the past 4 years, controlling for opportunity to feed. And so first I'll show you the response when we remove a non-donor, and then I'll show you the key donor being removed. So if the bats are just making errors, and actually the best thing to do is just to feed these kin, then we predict this sort of relationship, that the bats are doing best when they have the smaller, tighter networks. Or it could be the opposite, and just having more is better. And these bats do better when they have, bats just consistently do better when they have more relationships. And social bet hedging says it's going to depend on the situation. So you're not going to see a benefit, or maybe there's even a cost in a typical situation. But then when you remove the key donor, suddenly these other relationships end up being important. Okay, and so this is the actual data. So under normal circumstances, females that helped more non-kin are not receiving more food on a typical day. But when we remove the key donor, we now see this opposite relationship. The females that helped more non-kin did receive more food. And one way to just look at this interaction is just look at the loss of food received when we remove your primary donor. The bats with fewer non-kin bonds, they suffered larger losses when their key donor is removed, and bats that invested in more non-kin coped better with this because they had more donors, because they fed more bats. And so these weak non-kin bonds do appear to provide a cryptic benefit that's not obvious at first. If you were to just not perturb the system, you might not see that there was this benefit to having these non-kin bonds. Okay, so I'd like to replicate this whole study again, and also I think it's interesting to look for evidence of this in other species as well. So talk to me if you're interested in that. But basically, this is evidence that weak non-kin bonds provide backup donors when these primary kin donors go missing. And the other point I want to make here is that females are really investing in particular individuals. The individuals are not interchangeable. They're not investing in the whole group, or just sort of just trying to make sure that they have a larger network of individuals around them. Each relationship is distinct. So this idea requires that there is this trade-off between relationship quality and quantity. And there's now increasing evidence for this in some other species. So we see a within individual trade-off between quality and quantity now in macaques and grooming networks and macaques, and also in lance-tailed mannequins. And so if you want to look for this trade-off, you have to look within the individuals. So different individuals might be just because they have more resources or just sort of better and as have more social capital in general, that you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a trade-off across individuals, but within individuals, this is what this idea assumes, that there is a sort of limited amount of time that you can put in either more individuals or spend more time with fewer individuals. And there is evidence for this now in other species. There's also evidence from other social animals that individuals try to replace lost relationships. So in baboons and great tits, we see this where individual in the group dies, and then, for instance, a mother dies, and the daughter then extends grooming to more individuals in the group, presumably to try to compensate for that loss in her network. And so what I like about this idea of social bet hedging is, like some other ideas, an example of how individual decisions can shape social networks. And we have a lot of evidence that networks have consequences for individuals. So your position in a network feeds back on your health and your reproduction and your survival. This is true across a range of different taxa. And what I'm particularly interested in is the other processes. So in the individual decisions that are made that shape where you are in that network, and what things do individuals have control over, what things do they not have control over? What sort of network ties are they just going to have because of virtue of, say, who their mother is or how they're born into the network, versus what are the things what are the levers that they can pull to try to change their position within the social network? And so social bet hedging is one such example of this kind of thing. We're also interested in other things like social inheritance of new relationships. So we don't know the answer to that yet, but we're looking at whether vampire bats inherit the ties of their parents. So I want to come back a little bit and talk about this topic of just a social relationship, and what does that really mean, and do we get anything out of thinking about these relationships as actual relationships rather than just as things being exchanged. And so I think there is value in thinking of these as relationships where there's some fluidity or some connection across contexts and also across different kinds of currencies. So we know that bats invest in preferred associates. And what I'm going to hope to show you is that these relationships persist from the lab to the field. They persist from different contexts, like inside the roost to outside the roost. And I also want to talk about this question of, is it the case that when you're more highly associated with particular individuals, does this increase the competition that you have with these individuals? So all of this work, all of our field work has been enabled by these amazing proximity sensors, which were developed by my postdoc Simon Ripperger over a period of several years with a team of German computer scientists and engineers. And these are essentially kind of next generation proximity loggers. They're very small. You can get the data wirelessly without having to recapture the animals. So we just glue these on the bats, and they log encounters with other tag bats every 2 seconds. So we can track encounters inside the roost and also outside the roost, as long as the tags stay glued on to the animals. And so they get I'm sorry, I didn't mention, they communicate an estimate of the distance between the tags, and also the exact time of when these encounters happen. So in one experiment, we tested if cooperative relationships that we were studying in the lab, would these persist in the wild? So we had these bats in captivity for almost 2 years, and we saw that cooperation was increasing in captivity in specific dyads. Then we released them back into the wild where we caught them. We put them right back in the tree where we caught them. And we put the proximity sensors on them to continue tracking these relationships in the wild. We also put proximity sensors on a control group from the same roost. And we basically wanted to know, one, will the captive bats reform the social networks that we observed in captivity when we released them in the wild? And did having them in captivity also sort of create a little subgroup that now these bats are going to be together more than the control group? So here we are, just releasing them back into the roost. And we could just see visually what was going on, which we later saw in the data. So because we color marked these tags, and we could see that the ones that we had in captivity were already clustering together. Also, the captive-born bats did not integrate well back into the wild colony, and they were getting in fights with the wild bats. Here's two of the captive-born individuals roosting like right on the edge of the entrance, where you would almost never see vampire bats roosting there. And the captive-born bats actually were eventually left this site. Potentially they were either pushed out, or they maybe were trying to home back to where they were born. We're not sure. But we could see these little subgroups forming. And so when we have the data, this is just to show you how high resolution the data are. So this is like different minutes of time. And so here the orange are the previously captive bats, and the purple are the bats that were never captive, the control group. As you could sort of see that there's a lot of fluidity here, that the social relationships are really fluid. There's a lot of movement inside of this tree. And we saw from day to day, the bats are roosting in different parts of this tree. They're not always roosting in the same place. And so the relationships are not just being driven by spatial structure here. But basically what we found is that the previously captive test group, they roosted closer together in the wild, which you see here, this is the dark blue now. And they also roosted closest with their previous food sharing partners, who were also their grooming partners. And this is true even after you control for kinship. So food sharing, grooming, and kinship all correlated with each other. But after you control for kinship, you still see that food sharing and grooming are better predictors than kinship, because many of these relationships are between non-kin. So this is just showing the effect sizes here. Each of these is actually all of the average for an entire day of all the networks we can make in that day. And the days are sort of independent observations, because all the bats leave the roost and then come back the next day. And so the whole group breaks apart and then comes back together. So we're using these sensors now to try to understand how their associations with each other differ across all of these different contexts, and also looking at associations between, for instance, how much of grooming is just based on their spatial arrangement or not. One of the things that we could do here is, or that we did also when we were tracking them in the wild, is we looked at their co-foraging. And what we want to eventually do is make this sort of bat-cow network. And that's like one of the big parts of this grant, is to put sensors on the cows and GPS on the cows and get a sense of whether the bats are sharing wounds on the cows. In fact, we know that they're doing that, but we don't necessarily know with who they're doing that. Another thing that's sort of interesting is that we can make a network of the bats inside of a roost on a particular day, and then who they're encountering when they go out to forage. And so we could sort of get these paired associations both across days and within day, or if two bats are roosting together that day, are those bats more likely to then depart together or meet up with each other that subsequent night? And is there this kind of pairing that's even closer than we see across days? And so we have just so many different kinds of data that we can sort of use to predict social foraging, which is one I want to talk about next. So we have the roosting networks within each day and then across all of those days. And these are telling us different things. And whether on each day it predicts the social foraging for that night, and then across all nights. And then we have kinship, and we also have their interactions in captivity. And so this allowed us to sort of look at this question of social foraging in vampire bats, which is something that we haven't really understood from the literature, because it's just almost impossible to really understand what they're doing when they're flying out into the night. You can't observe them very easily. We tested several hypotheses for how social relationships might predict foraging. So I won't go through all of these, but I'll just tell you the one that turns out is best supported. So the idea here is that we have particular relationships that we know about, and we want to know, how do those relationships predict who they depart with and who they forage with? And the answer is that they don't actually depart together. In fact, none of the bats that we tagged in the control group or the test group really depart together. They depart independently from each other, but then later they meet up with each other and they have interactions over these cattle. And I'll show you some videos of that. So they don't hunt as a big group. They don't socially forage in like a flock of birds. But what happens is that they leave independently, they seem to commute independently, and then they sort of meet up with each other out on the cattle pasture. So here is just the data from one day. These are different bats. These are the bats that were in captivity together. Their foraging was really weird when we first released them, and then it kind of converged with the other bats, but they were leaving the roost like much earlier. This is hours after sunset. So what's interesting is the bats are actually pushing their foraging off right until sunrise, which is here. So this is 6 a.m. 6 a.m. here, the sun rises, And these bats are just waiting all through the night. They're staying inside that tree. They come out for this period of time. These dots are bats encountering other bats. So these are this foraging encounters between individuals. And then this is the foraging window. This is when they're foraging. And so they're not departing together, but they're having these encounters. They're having them consistently with the same individuals, and they're having them more often with the individuals that they are grooming and food sharing with. And so these interactions out on the cattle pasture are quite interesting. So sometimes the bats share an animal and they sort of peacefully tolerate each other. And other times they have fights with each other over a cat. And so we think these affiliative interactions are longer. And then the ones where they have fights, they tend to be really short. You don't tend to have these long, protracted fights. So there's an example of two bats like chasing each other away. But you also see bats, for instance, feeding from the same animal or even the same wound. When we taking this video, we also took calls. So we have a description of the kinds of calls they make. There's a number of calls that we're just now trying to like piece together their vocal communication. It's super complicated and we know very little about it. We know that, for instance, they have echolocation calls. They have other calls we don't know what they do. We know they make them when they're in flight. We know that these contact calls, the bats can recognize each other using these calls. They make them when they're isolated in captivity. We have a huge study we're doing to try to unpack what kind of information is in there, if they can identify, for instance, unfamiliar kin in these calls, or whether there's even vocal convergence, vocal learning in these calls. We have something like 800,000 of these calls recorded from particular individuals. But when we're out on the cattle pasture, we recorded these calls, or Simon recorded these calls, Simon Ripperger, that I've never seen before, looking at a lot of vampire bat calls. And so these are calls that we think are associated with this social foraging. We don't know what they do, so maybe we'll get at that. And they also have aggressive calls they use for chasing each other away. One thing that's quite interesting is that when we've tried to look for evidence of a dominance hierarchy in female vampire bats, we haven't seen very evidence for a very clear linear dominance hierarchy like you see in some primates. But this is done in captivity, so it might be that we need to do this in different ways. But it's very obvious just from watching them that they don't have the kinds of competitive interactions. They don't have such a clear dominance hierarchy that is obvious in other species. So this is one way of showing a dominance hierarchy. So here's a probability that the higher rank wins, and this is a difference in rank. And so you can see in baboons and macaques that dominant individuals are always winning these interactions. With vampire bats, it never really becomes clear. And so I think one thing that's going on here is that the vampire bats are not competing with the same individuals that they're roosting with in the way that you would if you're a stable group that's moving around. And the individuals that you are always with, when you come across food, you come across that food together, and you have to figure out who's going to get access to this food first. I don't think this is necessarily the case with vampire bats. I think that often these encounters that we're seeing, I haven't confirmed this yet, but I think most of these are these competitive interactions are bats that are not from the same roost or are not highly associated with each other. So this is something that we're just looking at now. But basically, the prediction I would make here is that most competition over wounds or prey are occurring among these unfamiliar bats, and that there might be this kind of scale of competition effect that comes into play here, where female vampire bats are competing sort of globally with bats from this larger population, and then sharing food and possibly sharing prey with a subset of individuals sort of sharing locally. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'm just going to jump through these last few slides. Sorry, I went too slow there. So why is it that vampire bats share food? I think kinship is important. I think other forms of interdependence might be important, hard to exactly measure interdependence. And I think reciprocal returns are important. I think they're conditional on the quality of the relationship that they have. How do vampire bats share food? Or how do the relationships start? I think they raise the stakes through these lower cost behaviors. And what do we mean by cooperative relationship? They're making investments in preferred associations that are stable across different social environments and that provide multiple benefits. And I'll sort of just skip through here, but basically, I think what has happened in the evolutionary history of vampire bats is that this is behavior that evolved through kin selection. And I think that over time, you have situations where bats have a choice about which kin they're going to invest in. They have a bias towards kin that they have stronger relationships with. And this then can be co-opted to provide direct fitness benefits, where you're going to invest in bats even outside of your family, simply because you have a very strong reciprocal relationship with those individuals. And if that's the case, then you might engage in some sort of social networking where you want to form new bonds outside of your family. And I'll say that we are now testing still. I have not answered the question of whether or not bats test partner choice, or whether they do partner choice or partner switching, whether they defect away from bats that we prevent sharing with them. We would have had this done during the pandemic. I've been saying I'm going to do this experiment for like 10 years, but the jury's still out on this. But basically, I think vampire bats are a really great example to study how these kinds of relationships form. Does individual variation matter? Can we force them into associations and see if that starts relationships? We're doing that now. How important are first impressions? We're doing studies on that. How important is similarity of their personality or other traits, or being presented with a shared common challenge or enemy? These are all things that we think might be involved with forming these new relationships. And I'm sorry that I went a little bit over, but I'll leave you with my thank you slide that has too many names for me to go through, and hopefully we have time for questions.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for that really excellent talk. If you don't mind, could you stop share screen? And
Yes.
we now have, so the way this works, just a reminder to everyone, the question and answer session, please drop your question marks in the chat and I will call on you. And YouTube, there'll be people watching YouTube and will relay that to me. And when you ask your question, please introduce yourself. We're trying to build a community here. And so tell us just, where you're from and a little bit about yourself before you ask your question. And so to start, the first question I see coming in is from Eduardo.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry, for a wonderful talk. Fascinating topic. I'm sure that we're going to have lots and lots of questions. And as a person, I'm at Yale University, and I study social relationships, primarily with pair-living taxa, pair-living primate taxa. And I was hoping you can comment some more, because I thought it's a fascinating idea what you threw at us of really thinking what is a relationship. And those of us who tend to focus probably too much on primates tend to assume that everything a monkey does ought to be extremely complicated. But I mean, but now, of course, people have raised the issue that, well, suddenly when we start getting into the black box of how things are done, the mechanisms may be much simpler than we sometimes have inferred for primates. So, of course, it's a complicated matter, but I'd like to hear some more from you. So you said, if I remember well, that you think of a relationship just as exchanging some kind of goods. But so how do we make progress in making the difference between the relationship that I have with the person who sells me the groceries and what we're usually describing as a social relationship that, without saying it, it's implying some kind of stronger emotional connection? So I'm just curious if you can share some more of how you're thinking about this, which I think is very, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think some of the tension with relationships in primates comes from like a tension between, if I understand the literature correctly, it comes from a tension between the idea of a social bond as a kind of abstraction and the idea of that you get from like biological market theory of having this exchange for immediate cost for immediate benefit. And I think that it's really important to integrate both of these things. And I think one way to think about it, or at least the way I think about it, is that I actually can have a relationship with a certain vendor, right? So I can compare prices at like Walmart and Kmart, but I might have an association with a Walmart that I begin to have a sort of brand loyalty, because after I've had enough positive interactions at Walmart that now I'm sort of loosened in my strict investment in terms of like which place am I going to go, rather than always comparing the prices and always what seems like the strict rational thing to do, which would be to always go to the vendor that gives me the best price. I think people actually do have a kind of heuristic that just says, well, I've gone to Walmart and it's been good there. And so if I go some other place, I don't really know what that's going to be like. And so I think this is maybe a way to sort of integrate these things, is that you sort of, the idea that individuals might generalize about a particular a particular individual and say, well, this is an individual that I have had a history of positive relationships with, and that in of itself might be valuable as a piece of information, even independent of the exact experiences I've had. Like how exactly that weighting takes place, I don't know, but I think this is how I would think about it. If I had, what if I had 3 positive experiences and 1 negative experience with one individual, and then only have 1 experience that's positive with another individual? How do I integrate that information? Do I say, well, 100% of my interactions were negative over here and only part of them were positive over here? Or do I weight the fact that I have more information about one individual? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think this is like one thing that would be interesting to figure out. And I think it's similar to the way that it's similar to how individuals would learn about any other thing, like learning about where food is and how you might weight the information in different ways or integrate that information in different ways. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat, but listening to you helped me realize that I think that an inherent property of a relationship, not maybe in the literature that you cited for primates, but in the literature in psychology, where people have really studied relationships for the power they bring to the well-being of individuals, is what happens when you sever the relationship. And that has been, so I follow you. Yes, when people talk about the bonds in field primatology, we're not assessing how much the individual would suffer from having that relationship broken. So if Walmart leaves town, I just move on to Kmart. Most of us would like to think. I'm not going to mourn Kmart or Walmart leaving. So how do we in field work assess the relationship when it is so hard to assess the consequences of losing the relationship, which we know that in humans, that's really how we assess the role that relationship it has when we don't have it. I mean, the mother offspring, the mates, the parents and son, the parents and offspring. Thank you. No, I know it's difficult, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts. I think it's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Okay, our next question comes from Cheyenne.
Hi, I'm Cheyenne. I'm a master's student at Lauren's lab at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. I was just kind of more interested in those proximity trackers that you had because I know you said that they can live for quite a long time in the wild and you don't have to retrieve those trackers. So I just wondered how long those kind of track for. And then also, are you putting those on males and females? Or are you just putting them on the females? Because I'm kind of interested, what are the males up to? Because most of this is female centered, right?
Yeah, so we're only looking at females right now. And so we actually know very little comparatively about the males. So all of that data I showed you is from females. In terms of the sensors, the limit is not the battery, it's actually just the glue. So we attach them in such a way that we know that they'll fall off eventually. And they start falling off after about a week, but they can stay on for 2 weeks. But the sensors can go on much longer than that. And you'll have to go to the papers in PLOS biology to get the specs on exactly how long they can last.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question comes from Peter Kapler.
Thank you. Hi, Peter Kapler calling in from Göttingen in Germany. Congratulations for an excellent talk and for doing fascinating work. I have a question about the food sharing interactions, which you've analyzed, from so many angles, but it appears to me that there's an important behavioral detail missing, which might be so obvious to you that you didn't mention it, but it also did not appear in your analysis. And I was wondering who initiates the interaction? Is there some sort of begging or solicitation, or is the donor actively approaching, somebody in need and assesses the need somehow? And I think that is an important part of the story when you investigate who is interacting with whom.
Yeah, so surprisingly, the donors initiate most of these interactions, and the way that it comes about is when I put the fasted bat in, sometimes they call But even if they're not calling, they're always making sound. And I think this is what calls over particular individuals. So if an individual flies over there, it's very much the case that that individual is likely to then donate. But the way this typically happens is the donor comes over, starts grooming the recipient all over, and then begins targeting the face and starts licking the lips of the receiver. And I think this is basically like a sort of signal that says, I will intend to feed you. And then when that happens, they get belly to belly. The receiver then licks the mouth of the donor opens her mouth, and the receiver licks the blood out of the donor's mouth. And one of the reasons why I was doing that experiment with putting the bats in the cage is that you could really see this is not just based on harassment or begging, because the bats will fly down to the cage and feed that individual inside the cage. And that was also not just kin that did that, but non-kin.
And any idea what kind of cues they might be using to identify potential recipients?
Well, they can recognize individuals from the contact calls that they make, but it's also possible that they could also recognize individuals just from their echolocation. So that when the bats are looking around, they're making the sound. And we haven't demonstrated this, but it's in theory, it's possible that every bat actually knows who's around it. We know in other bat species that bats can discriminate individuals by echolocation calls. And so it wouldn't be surprising if these bats' perception of their social world is actually quite good, and that it's possible that they could know who's behind them and who's coming and going, even though this is all happening in the dark.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Clara.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm Clara Ditten from the University of Bern, also a PhD student like Cheyenne, and well, actually, see that message. Never mind. My question was something that also Cheyenne had touched upon, with that you're mainly concentrating on females. I'm quite puzzled about that you said that it's mostly females sharing, and I was just wondering, do you have a theory of why it might be beneficial for females to do this but not for males, and why there might not be any effects on partner choice and reproduction?
Yeah, it's kind of a something I've been really puzzled about, is that if the males are not engaging in this food sharing, they should be dying like crazy and have much shorter lifespans. And so I don't know if Jerry Wilkinson and I have looked at this the same way. I think he thinks that is the case, but I have the data set from Argentina looking at really long spans of time where I didn't see any evidence that the males were dying way more than the females, which makes me wonder if the food sharing is actually more about reproduction than about survival. But it's also the case that these bats are living in an environment that's so different than the way that the environment they evolved in, because now they have livestock everywhere, and their ability to get blood must just be so much easier than it ever has been. So it's difficult to sort of get at that question. But yeah, I don't know what is going on so well with the males. It's possible that these males are sharing food in like little bachelor colonies that we just haven't even looked at. But within a female group, what's happening is that the males are mostly trying to monopolize on a site and set up a territory and exclude the other males. And they don't have long-term relationships with either the females in that group, maybe a little bit, but not as much as other females. And they don't even guard the females. The females can come and go. The females are in fact larger than the males. And the female social structure is sort of existing independent of the space of these different roost sites, whereas the males are mainly competing and trying to own these roost sites. So that's one difference. The other being potentially that the females are making such big investments in offspring that might also be involved. But I think that we don't fully understand what's going on with males.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, our next question comes from Michael Taborski.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Taborski from the University of Bern. Thank you very much, Thierry, for this interesting talk. I like particularly to learn more about the behavior of these animals from the field. I mean, I think it's great that you additionally collect information now from the field in addition to your beautiful experiments from the lab. What I think would be a sort of $1 million question is, if you compare the relative importance of kin selection and reciprocity, we should know something about the fitness effects of relatedness versus this kind of insurance strategy that is involved in reciprocity. And probably you don't have any hard data about that, but I would like to know first whether you have any guesses of relative importance regarding fitness effects, and secondly, whether you see any possibility to measure fitness effects really in a natural situation, because I think that would be really the the final thing that we would like to know to understand the relative importance of kin selection and reciprocity in this system.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to try to disentangle the direct and indirect fitness benefits, especially if they are interacting with each other. I mean, so, you know, you have that study with that I always discuss, where you have interactions between the enforcement and kinship, that there could be the level of enforcement might differ. I'm using enforcement a little different than what you use before. I'm using enforcement to mean just like any sort of conditional behavior that would stabilize or enforce the cooperation. But I don't know how you go about trying to disentangle these things once you have interactions between them. Becomes difficult. And so I think we'd have to understand that first. We'd have to know if a vampire bat treats defection differently from kin versus non-kin. That's like the first thing we'd have to figure out, which we don't know. But even then, I'm not sure how we could exactly measure those contributions or try to disentangle them from each other. And I think I wouldn't even know. I mean, maybe there are people here who would know like the best way of doing that. But if you take the example of eusocial insects that I really like, with the role of enforcement and worker policing in eusocial insects, I mean, there's kind of a mix of, well, kin selection being involved in obviously the origin of this, but now if it's being maintained in large part by this enforcement behavior, how do you disentangle these things? I'm not sure if I'm the person to even attempt to tackle that. We have a long way to go because we don't even know any fitness effects in vampire bats yet. So I don't know is the answer.
What I'm asking for is whether there is any chance to measure the the potential effect of receiving blood if you're in dire straits. I mean, if you're in a difficult situation because you haven't got a meal for 1 or 2 nights, how often does this happen that really a social partner saves your life, or at least increases your chances to survive and reproduce? I think that's the kind of data that would be important.
Yeah, so I mean, in the original Nature paper by Jerry Wilkinson, he had a sort of plot or a very simple model of trying to estimate this to demonstrate that you've got this like diminishing returns curve, or you could think about it as a bat's moving closer to starvation time, the value of that blood is increasing. So the donor is paying a smaller cost to help the receivers getting a larger benefit. I don't actually know if that does the work that people think, because that is also expected under kin selection, that you would have that basic principle of diminishing returns working, and the idea that the cost to you, if the cost to you is lower and the benefit to the other individual is greater, I think that works with pretty much any explanation of cooperation is going to follow from that. Sorry, I'm kind of going off topic here, but yeah, I guess I don't know if I want to do that experiment of denying the reciprocations to the bats and then having them perish, or if there was another way to do it. I guess if you had enough longitudinal data, you could look for cases where bats were failing to get fed and then seeing if this decreases their survival and reproduction. But that would require a very different kind of study than what we've been doing. But is that what you mean? Or
Yeah, I'm mainly interested in information from the natural situation, of course, not experimentally starving bats, but rather whether in the field you would be able to obtain information about the negative effects of starvation that can be compensated by the mutual feeding.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is that the bats are living in a situation that is so different from most of their evolutionary history, and I think that the food their hunting success is probably much higher now than it ever has been. Their populations have just gotten so big in some certain areas, and I think that in places where you don't have agriculture, vampire bats have these very small groups, and you rarely catch them. But in areas where you have livestock or large aggregations of any sort of animal, you get these really large colonies. And so, yeah, I mean, it would be, I think that maybe a place to start would be to compare vampire bat populations in areas that are not, where they're not dependent on agriculture versus areas where they're feeding on like seals and sea lions or completely natural prey, and seeing if there's different rates of food sharing there. But I feel like I'd want to understand that before I try to draw inferences from any wild population of vampire bats, just because the rate of needing food is probably different than it has been through most of their evolutionary history. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So it's challenging.
Okay, our next question comes from Susan Perry.
Hi, I study white-faced capuchin monkeys in the wild, and I'm interested in all the same questions you are. And I was particularly interested in your closing remarks where you were saying that you're interested in understanding tests of bonds and partner switching. And because that's something that I've been looking at in capuchins. Do you have any kinds of putative Zahavian bond tests that your animals do? How do you think they get information about the quality of their bonds?
Yeah, we haven't tested for that. We haven't, that's something that we should look at, but we haven't, we haven't looked at this sort of like bond testing. So yeah, we need to do that. Yeah, I don't know. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so thanks. Amazing talk.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of this. It's something I remember reading some of those papers and thinking like, oh, we really need to look for this sort of thing in vampire bats, and then just too many things.
I know.
Okay, so next question comes from Ben Thornley.
Hi, I'm Ben Thornley. I'm a second year student from the University of Derby. I think you kind of answered my question when you answered Clara's. I was just wondering what kind of mating system the bats have, and if like the relationships they form has any bearing on mate selection.
Don't know about the second one. I mean, I think wouldn't be surprising if males are sharing food with females that they're mating with. But the mating system is basically resource defense, polygyny. Males are defending a resource, and then a dominant male might have something around up to half of the paternities in a group, but they're definitely not monopolizing all of the paternities in the females that are in their territory.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is Delphine Demore.
Yes. Hello, I'm a postdoc student in Exeter University with Lauren Brent. I'm studying the variation of social structure in macaques and socio-ecological pressures that can explain this variation. Excellent talk as usual, Jerry. And I just wanted to follow up on the first question by Eduardo about the difference between like biological market exchanges without a social relationship, and when you would say this then becomes a social relationship, and when you would say this becomes a social bond, and what are like the thresholds and how you think they are different to each other.
Between a relationship and a bond?
So to me, the difference between a relationship and a bond is that a bond needs to be strong, stable, and equitable, whereas a relationship can be anything that is predicted by previous interactions. And so I would suspect that a socially bonded individual will accept much more negative behaviors or like failure of reciprocity or so on from a bond partner. But for me, the more difficult thing is how you decide whether we are in a biological market exchange or whether we're having a social relationship. And when you say you move to the one or the other.
I guess I would, well, first I would say that I don't know if I have a strong opinion about define the definitions of the term. I would rather just, I would want to converge with whatever everyone else is using more than come up. I feel like I have probably defined some of these terms differently in different papers. So I try to define it per paper, but I'm always just trying to figure out which term to use to converge with who, but there's so many different labs using different terms in different ways. But I guess I mean, maybe I'll send, I've started a manuscript on this and I never finished it. It's just, semester's been crazy. So maybe I'll send you this for feedback, but I'm really interested in trying to merge these ideas of biological markets and relationships. And I feel like they're too opposed to each other and that there needs to be a kind of way to talk about both of them occurring at the same time and how would we integrate them? So I guess that's how I would answer that question.
But so just to follow up, would you say that as soon as individuals interact repeatedly, they'll have a relationship, or do they not necessarily have a relationship?
You could define it that way. So I think this is just how we defined it that way in the current biology paper. We defined it based on the repeat, like individuals grooming each other. In the current biology paper, we use a relationship to mean the thing that we're measuring. Like if these individuals are grooming each other over time, we say that that's a grooming relationship. It's like an edge in the network. And then we use the term bond to refer to the thing that we can't measure that's like inside the mind of the animal that we're inferring from these things that we are observing. But I'm not particularly tied to that definition. It was just useful for that to explain what it is we're talking about. But so I don't, if I answer, I mean, is your question about like how I would define the terms or what's the best definition of the terms?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you that I feel that the terms are used like to mean very different things. And because you wrote this really great paper on reciprocity where you merged all of the ideas and came up with new ideas, I wondered if you had also a similar mindset regarding relationships, but it's in the making, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I'll leave that up to other people to try to, I mean, it was rough enough with reciprocity, and that's such a like contentious issue and everybody defines it differently. And I don't know if I had an impact on how people use that term. So
I liked it.
Okay, so I'm going to now give people from, YouTube an opportunity to ask questions. I see there are some folks there that had a question. So Cheyenne, can you relay those?
Yeah, so this question is from Clara B. Jones. And they said, regarding lactation, do mothers nurse their young?
Yeah.
And just for my own curiosity, so what do you know about when they switch from nursing to blood meals, or do they do it?
So I think they start feeding them right away. And Jerry Wilkinson also, I think he told me that he saw a mother regurgitating blood to a newborn pup. In the literature, it talks about a gradual transition from milk to blood. But it could just be that the regurgitations ramp up or become more obvious later. But I think that these things happen are happening at the same time. The mother's regurgitating blood and also nursing, and the regurgitations occur before the pup is weaned.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so our next question comes from Marion.
Hello, sorry, my video is not working. Thanks for the talk. You said that there's some bats that only share with kin and some bats that are happy to share with lots of non-kin, and suggested that it might have something to do with the environment, how stable the environment is, how likely it is that the main donor with whom they interact is dying or something like that. If bats were a primate, I think somebody would immediately have thought about personality, and I think it also links with a comment by Lindsay. So have you checked whether these patterns, who is interacting also with non-kin and who is only interacting with kin, is sort of related to some measure of personality, like boldness or something like that?
Yeah, so I basically think it is a kind of a personality. It's like a sort of cooperativeness, and the best evidence that we have of that now, which I didn't present because we're still analyzing it, is when you introduce several bats to a panel of strangers, everybody's on equal footing. So if you meet, say, 14 non-kin, some individuals start just trying to form a relationship with these individuals and others don't. And that could be effect too of like who's in their in-group. But I think that there is strong individual variation between these bats. One thing that we're looking at now is oxytocin and vasopressin receptor density in the brains of bats, comparing different species, but also within vampire bats, different females that vary in terms of their grooming and food sharing rates. We haven't correlated it with, we haven't done this yet. We haven't correlated it with things like how much they move around or boldness. We haven't correlated with other kinds of personality traits yet, but we actually have some data. There was a student that worked on a project similar to that, but then I don't know if I don't think it was finished. But one thing we can easily do is look at movement as a driver of grooming and food sharing. And if bats that are just moving around a lot, if those are the bats that have more connections and are grooming and food sharing more individuals simply as a byproduct of just being a high movement individual. And that's something we're still working on looking at.
Thank you.
All right, so next question is from Zulema.
Yes, hi. Zulema Tang Martinez from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And before I retired, I worked on social behavior, particularly communication and kin recognition in rodents. So I found this to be completely fascinating. Great talk. I have several questions, and some are just, I think easier than others. So I'll just tell you what they are, and if you need me to repeat them, I can. First, do we know anything about the sex ratio in the wild? Second, is there any evidence of communal nursing among the females? Are they ever nursing pups from another female? And those are probably the easier ones. And then the other ones are, what happens when a non-related strange female enters a new group? Because you mentioned that sometimes you get dispersal of females into new groups. And I was just wondering what the process of integration into that new group was. And the other question is, the bats fly out of the roost individually on their own, but somehow in this great big world out there, they're able to meet up with their quote unquote partners, social partners. And I wonder if you have any idea how that comes about. Do you think they're following echolocating calls, or whether there's some other mechanism by which they're able to meet up again on the cow, on a specific cow, once they're out there? Again, it seems like, once they're out of there, it's an enormous number of cows, and the environment is huge. So how do they manage to hook up with their partners on the same cow?
I'm going to work backwards, and I might need you to remind me of these questions. So let me start with the last question, which is that we really need to have the flight trajectories of the bats, which we actually tried to get in the study, but the whole thing just was a disaster, and we had a grid of antennas that were tracking the bats to try to reconstruct like you would with a sort of high resolution GPS. And we just didn't have that. So it's, we don't really know exactly what's going on in terms of how they're coordinating, how they're coming together, and whether this is something where they're following each other at long distance that's just not detecting encounters. I think it's probably via sound. Bats in general will eavesdrop on echolocation calls of other bats and then go to places where they hear foraging success because they can hear bats catching insects. Vampire bats make very low amplitude calls that are also highly directional because of the family that they're in. They're leaf-nosed bats. And so it's unlikely that they can't hear echolocation calls as well as most other bats can, but they also make these low frequency social calls, like some of the ones I showed the spectrograms of. And I think I would not be surprised if they're using these to coordinate some of these reunions out in the field. So that's my best guess at this point. We know that they make these social calls when they're out on the cattle pasture. So the question before that, can you remind me of some of these ones?
Yeah, it was about when you have females who are.
Oh, how do they integrate? We don't know in the wild. So Jerry Wilkinson has just noted that females would join the groups, but I don't think he had the resolution of data to know exactly what that integration process looked like. So all that we have from that are these like captive studies where I'm mashing individuals together in a captivity. So I don't know if it looks the same as in the wild. The other question was,
I had a question about sex ratio and about whether you ever see communal nursing.
So with communal nursing, no, we didn't see in the field data. I don't think there was any evidence of communal nursing. There have been, I think, at least four cases of non-kin adoption in vampire bats. They're all in captivity, and it only happens when the female dies and leaves a pup there. And we had one of these cases that we just wrote a paper on it actually, but there's also a number of other cases that are sort of in the literature, but kind of really buried. They're like in these conference proceedings from 1980. And I don't know if it's like people aren't aware of it, but there is this kind of anecdote out there that vampire bats adopt non-kin, which I have heard about through word of mouth. And I just said, like, I don't know where this comes from, but it comes from this German lab where they had seen several examples of this. They actually discovered regurgitated food sharing before Jerry Wilkinson and talked about it in the same conference paper. But we also saw this, and I don't think this is an adaptive trait. I think it's just an extension of this extreme maternal care, but it kind of gives an insight into how food sharing might have evolved too, because I think these are traits being co-opted. So sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but that's what we've seen in terms of communal. No, I haven't seen communal nursing, but I have seen a female adopt an unrelated pup. And then with the sex ratio, do you mean like just in general in the population, or do you mean within?
Yeah, under wild conditions, like, you were talking about the fact that there's some debate as to whether males suffer higher mortality because they share less. And so I was wondering if you look at natural populations, if you see any evidence in terms of the sex ratio.
Yeah, so this is what what I had noted is that I didn't exceed the expected difference in terms of, so there was a study, the best data set, long-term data set that you could use for this is these rabies workers in Argentina who'd been captured, like it's basically mark recapture with vampire bats over a period of like 30 years. And I looked in the data set and did not see evidence that males had lower longevity than females. There were males that were living just as long as females. I didn't see the difference that I expected, which makes me skeptical a little bit about whether this food sharing is actually bolstering the survival of these individuals, because I would expect to see that. So this is still in my mind like a mystery. But there's also a lot of things I've noticed about differences of populations of vampire bats. So it's possible that food sharing, I have gone to some sites and not seen food sharing at all. And so it's possible that the rates of food sharing differ between different populations as well. So I don't know. So it's still an open question.
Yep. Thanks. It's an incredibly fascinating system. Great talk.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so our next question is from, is it Carolina?
Yeah, it's Carolina.
Carolina?
Hi, I'm Carolina Pacheco. I'm a PhD student from the University of Porto, Portugal. And very interesting talk, really, thanks. My question was a bit about the correlation between the food sharing and reproduction, which you already touched a bit about in the other questions about the females being phallopatric. And a bit of follow-up to that was that if you saw any kind of relationship between, or correlation between the body weight and the reciprocal relationships, especially between non-kin partners, like for instance, keeping the best individuals as an assurance for a challenging environment or for some disabilities.
So was the first part of the question like a correlation between body size and food sharing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, with non-kin individuals.
I haven't found any like phenotypic predictor of that variation in non-kin food sharing. So I didn't see effect of like age or body size, but this is a really small sample size when you're looking at number of individuals. I think there was like 14 individuals that I had that long-term data on. So it's just not the right kind of data set either. But what was the second question was about, or was there a second?
No, not the second, just if you saw that correlation could be a way of the individuals keeping an insurance policy, let's say, of keeping the best individuals as, or having a relationship with the best individuals within the population that could help.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either, but I'd be interested. I'm interested in that question, but I don't know if they have other cues of who's a valuable partner before they even have experiences with these partners.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Filippo.
Hi, thanks, Gerald. Very nice talk, really good. I'm Filippo Aureli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. And I want first a very brief comment on the relationship issue and biological market and so on. I don't see any problem there. There's nothing to just I think if we follow Robert Hines' framework, everything fits very nicely. I think the problem was that to see certain aspects of the social relation going in the future. But if we look only at the past, as Delphine were mentioning about previous social relationship, I think it should be much easier to fix to put everything in there. Then it's a matter of why do we need a term bond when we have already social relationship, but that's another story. My question is something else instead. It was since you mentioned that the non-kin exchange, or at least at the beginning, the non-kin investment in non-kin, it could be a safety when there's no kin present and so on. I was wondering if you have seen, again, maybe for the same reason, some potential development of indirect reciprocity. So basically try to get reputation. And so whenever you don't, if you don't have, there will be plenty of others that will exchange with you because you are the one known that you will exchange. And I thought that Michael was going to ask this question. So I'm asking, I waited for putting my question mark after Michael asked the question.
I haven't thought, I mean, I've thought about it, but I haven't thought of a way of how to test it. Another thing I want to do is look again at generalized reciprocity, which Michael's has evidence for and developed this idea of as a kind of extension of like winner-loser effects, but to cooperation. I think I looked at this early on, but now we've collected so much more data. This is something I want to revisit to look at more evidence for that. But I haven't thought about how to even test indirect reciprocity and what it would even look like for a vampire bat, given that I don't even know what they perceive. Like I was telling you that it's possible that they can perceive who's around them, or maybe they can't, in which case they don't know who's around them. They only know who they're immediately like smelling or next to. And so it's hard for me to know what each individual can know about the other individuals, unlike with primates where you see one looking at the other and you can presume that this individual knows what's happening over there. Whereas I have no idea what their perception of their social world is in each given moment.
Yeah. So doing audience effect or third party is much more complicated because of that.
Yeah, I don't know I don't know what the range of audience is. Whether there's two bats sharing food, I don't know if the one that's 3 inches over is aware of that or not. I mean, sometimes I get a sense of it because I see them coming over and trying to get the food that's being passed, and I see bats sort of. But I have seen things just anecdotally that make me suggest that sometimes they're confused about who they're with. So for instance, I've seen a case where, I don't remember if it was the daughter feeding the mother or vice versa, but a bat was sharing food with another bat. And then there was a bat that landed right next to them. Everybody got jostled. And in that moment, another female then came up in between the daughter and the mother and was in the position to receive the blood from the donor. And the donor started to like share food. And then after like a couple seconds, there was this acknowledgement of like, you're not the bat I'm trying to share food with. And then this like hitting of the thumbs. And then that one flew away. And then she found the proper recipient. So like little moments like that make me think like, maybe it's a bit confusing who they're with in these situations. And so it's an open question for me.
Thank you.
All right, our next next question is from Maren.
Hello again. My second question relates to something you said to Sulema. So when you said that the sex ratio of males and females is very similar and that therefore you don't have any evidence how important essentially the food sharing really is. I think it's not quite fair to compare males and females. I mean, you said something like they have a pup every year, they have a gestation period of 7 months, they have a lactation period of I don't know how many months. So essentially, apparently the females are either all the time gestating or lactating. Do you have any idea about how energy consume? I mean, they are flying and have a baby in the belly, so it must be quite energy demanding. Is there any information about how energy consuming it is? And could it mean that males don't have these energetic needs and therefore are not forced to be as cooperative as females are?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think is going on. But we haven't measured any sort of energetic costs. And Lauren was asking me about this too, if there was a way to like measure the energetic costs and benefits of the food sharing. And I haven't tried to do that. I think that even just measuring the energy of the regurgitation is difficult because I don't even think they're regurgitating blood. I think they're regurgitating something that's a little more valuable than blood. It's like a kind of blood honey where the water's been removed. And just from watching them, I think that they prefer to get this regurgitation than if they were given the choice between this and blood, they would rather have the regurgitated thing. So yeah, I do think that's what's going on. I haven't measured anything in terms of energetics.
Thank you.
Next question is from Karsten.
Yes, hello, I'm Carsten Schradin, a researcher at the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, studying small mammals in Southern Africa. Thanks a lot for a fascinating talk. It made me think a lot about cooperation and reciprocity again and new ideas. It's interesting you mentioned that maybe in males, this blood sharing is not so important. And in your talk, you also mentioned that there's huge variation between individuals, with some bats sharing a lot with everyone and some only with their mothers. So do you have any idea about heritability of this sharing? And as you can keep them nice in captivity, do you think you could have selection lines for very cooperative versus uncooperative vampire bats? And would that make sense?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I haven't had a long-term captive colony to work with since my PhD, so I'm starting one hopefully next year. So maybe we could get at these things a little better. But no, I haven't, tried to measure heritability. But I think it makes sense that it would take a really long time though to develop all of the lines and things. So it'd just be logistically difficult, but I think in theory it would work.
But you're still young, you have time.
Right.
I should have started with striped mice 20 years ago, but I missed this opportunity.
Okay, Eduardo, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, I think you showed us a slide communicating how the bats that you were returning to the tree took longer. I mean, it took them some time to adjust to the time when they would exit the tree at dusk. And I was wondering what was the light dark cycle you were keeping them in captivity, whether this was some kind of modification of their endogenous rhythm. And if you are controlling in all these measures of activity you've done for moonlight, and how much are they affected by moonlight in their activity patterns?
Yeah, they were on the same light dark cycle because the captive situation we had them in was actually a flight cage on the edge of the forest in this park that's it's hours drive away, but everything else is similar. So temperature and humidity and light they're all on the same rhythm. I'm sorry, my memory is so bad. What was this? The second thing was.
Well, we know these sessions are tiring, so I don't blame you. I understand. Do you know how moonlight?
Yeah.
Are they lunar phobic?
Yeah, they really.
And are you controlling for that?
Yeah, they really don't like it. Yeah, we could actually see it. I think in the data of the departure times, where every night it was like they're coming out later and later, and I think this had to do with the moonlight. They really don't like light of any kind. Yeah. So, and in fact, if they do have to come out, they'll even fly in the shadows. So they'll just fly along. Like if there's a row of trees, they'll fly directly only in the darkest part of the darkest areas that they can see. So I think it does affect their departure times. And I think we can see that in the data where everybody's, I don't think they're coming out if they perceive light outside.
Okay, so I think we have one more question in the queue, and I think after that I'll end the live stream because we have one more question from YouTube, so I'll take that as well. So I'm going to go with the YouTube question first. If Miles, can you please ask that?
Yeah, definitely. I'll introduce myself as well. Hi, everybody. I'm Miles. I'm a first-year master's student in Lauren Hayes' lab. And this question comes from Claudio Deola from the Universidad Latina in Mexico City. And they ask, do bats experience short-term costs from not sharing, i.e. being rejected, receiving aggression, etc.?
I don't know, because the answer, yeah, that was, so we're doing a series of studies now on really revisiting this. So during my PhD, I prevented food sharing between particular dyads, and I focused on the ones that were actually the strongest dyads, which maybe is not the best decision, but it's the best in terms of if you want to try to measure a change in the shortest amount of time. And basically we blocked food sharing from occurring in like mother-daughter pairs, for instance, for like 3 occasions. And we didn't see that suddenly the bats were stopped feeding their mothers or daughters or other bats, which is not too surprising. So now we're trying to force relationships to form or not form in the very beginning. We think this is way more likely to have an effect, that we can prevent bats from sharing when they're first meeting each other, then we might be able to direct partner choice towards the more cooperative individuals. And we're also doing partner switching on a more long-term scale, where we just repeatedly have bats that just do not reciprocate over extended periods of time to see how that changes their relationship. But those are the cases where we might start to see things, other changes in behavior. Maybe there's more like fights and things, but we haven't seen that yet. But we haven't really had the opportunity to see it.
Okay. Miles, were there any other questions from YouTube?
No, that was it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you. All right, so before I think I'll wrap it up after the next question, because Jerry has some more meetings and probably could use a little bit of a break. Before I do that, I just wanted to announce that, Jerry did give us some teaching slides that we are going to be posting on the website soon. So if you're interested in using the vampire bats in your lectures, I imagine sometime by the end of the week, they will be available on our website. We have various teaching resources there for you to use.
And just email me too if there's something different that you want. I have most of I can just share my whole presentation if that's helpful.
Great, thank you. So the last question is coming from Zulema.
Yeah, this may be a little far-fetched, but I was really struck by the fact that, as I understand it, lactation goes on for quite a long time, but yet the babies are able to begin drinking milk pretty much right after they're born. And so I know that there's some species of rodents in particular where nursing almost, and this is rodents that tend to have very precocial young, but they still nurse, and nursing may have a social bonding type of function. So that's one question. And then the other question is there any sort of trade-off between the nutritional content or how much the mother has to invest in producing rich milk, precisely because the young are able to start taking blood right away?
God, these are really good questions. I don't know the answers. I feel like every question I say, I don't know, but it's giving me lots of ideas of things to look at. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't even thought about looking at the contents of this milk. And yeah, I wonder if Jerry Wilkinson looked at that, because I remember talking with him and he was talking about getting milk out of vampire bats, and he was like giving them oxytocin so we can extract more milk. I can't recall what he did with that, or if he did anything with it. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer, but something to look at. Write this down.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the live stream. And before I do that, I just want to thank Jerry again for